It was one of those calm afternoons when the sun felt warm but not harsh, and the air carried that lazy quietness of a weekday. The boy had just finished basketball practice at the community gym. He was tired but happy, bouncing the ball gently as he walked home along the familiar street lined with maple trees. His earbuds played music low enough for him to still hear the sound of his sneakers scraping the sidewalk. It was his favorite time of day, that slow walk home where the world felt peaceful and life seemed simple. He wasn't thinking about anything serious, just the usual things that run through a teenager's mind. Homework he hadn't finished, what his mom might cook for dinner, maybe catching up with friends later. His backpack hung off one shoulder, a bit worn from the school year. He turned onto Maple Street, only a few blocks from his house. That's when he noticed a police car parked near the corner. Engine running, lights off but idling like it was waiting for something. He didn't think much of it. He'd seen patrol cars around before. It was a safe neighborhood, the kind of place where people waved to each other when walking their dogs. But this time felt different. As he walked past, he saw the cruiser suddenly move. The tires rolled forward slowly, and then the blue and red lights flashed on without the siren. He looked around, wondering if there was an accident or something. But there was no one else on the street. That's when he realized they were coming toward him. The car pulled up beside him and two officers stepped out. One was tall and older, with his sunglasses still on. The other looked younger, more nervous, like he was new to the job. The boy stopped walking, unsure of what was happening. His music kept playing faintly, but the sound suddenly felt far away. The older officer's voice cut through the silence. "Hey, you there." "Stop for a second," the boy blinked, taking out one earbud. "Me?" he asked. "Yeah, you," the officer said, walking closer. "Mind telling us where you're headed?" He felt his chest tighten. "Just walking home, sir," he said quietly. "Home? Where's that?" the younger officer asked, already glancing at the backpack. 2 blocks down," he replied, pointing. The older officer nodded but didn't seem convinced. "You live around here?" "Yes, sir. My mom works nearby. I'm just coming from basketball practice." The younger cop stepped a bit closer. "Got some ID on you?" That question made his stomach drop. He'd left his wallet in his gym bag back at the court. He hadn't needed it, he was just walking home. "I don't have it with me," he said carefully. "It's in my gym bag." The officers exchanged a quick look. The older one crossed his arms. "That's a problem," he muttered. Then louder, he said, "You fit the description of someone we're looking for." The boy frowned. "Someone you're looking for?" "Yeah," the younger one said. "Tall, dark hoodie, black shorts, around your age." He looked down at himself. He was wearing a gray hoodie and red shorts. His voice came out small. "I don't even look like that." The older officer sighed. "Look, kid, just cooperate. We're checking things out." He nodded, trying to stay calm. He'd been raised to be respectful, especially in situations like this. He didn't argue. He didn't move suddenly. "Okay," he said. "You can call my mom. Hands where I can see them," the younger officer interrupted sharply. He froze, his arms halfway between his sides and his chest. "I was just going to get my phone," he said quickly, heart pounding now. His voice shook even though he tried to sound steady. "Don't reach for anything," the older cop ordered, stepping forward slightly. His tone wasn't angry, but it carried weight, the kind that makes you hold your breath without realizing it. The street felt strangely empty. The sound of birds had gone quiet. Somewhere a dog barked in the distance. He could feel eyes on him. Neighbors looking through windows, curtains shifting slightly. But no one stepped outside. No one said a word. He wished his mom was there. She'd know what to do. She always did. She'd taught him how to stay calm, how to speak clearly, how to never give anyone a reason to feel threatened. But even with her advice echoing in his mind, his body betrayed him. His hands trembled slightly, his knees felt weak. The older officer asked for his name. He gave it softly. They radioed something in, voices low but serious. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. The sun had dipped a little lower, stretching the shadows long across the street. Sweat ran down his back even though the air was cool. He tried to explain again. "I live right down there," he said, nodding toward his house at the end of the block. "You can walk me there. My mom's probably—" "Stay where you are," the officer said firmly. He bit his lip and looked down, not wanting to make eye contact. He could feel his heart thudding against his ribs. He didn't know whether to be angry or scared or both. He hadn't done anything wrong, but here he was standing on the same street he'd grown up on, feeling like a stranger in his own neighborhood. The younger cop shifted uneasily, glancing at the patrol car. "Maybe we should wait for the radio confirmation," he said quietly to his partner. The older one nodded slightly but didn't lower his guard. "Yeah, we'll wait." The boy tried to steady his breathing. He thought about his mom again. She was probably wrapping up work, maybe driving home soon. He wanted to text her to tell her what was happening, but he didn't dare move his hands. The phone in his pocket suddenly felt heavy, like a forbidden object. A few more neighbors peeked through blinds. He noticed one elderly woman across the street whispering on her phone, probably calling someone. The silence between the officers and the boy stretched longer and longer, thick enough to make the air feel heavy. Then, in the distance, the faint sound of another car engine grew louder. He didn't notice it at first, but the older officer turned slightly, squinting down the street. The sound drew closer until a black SUV came into view, turning the corner fast. It slowed down just enough before stopping a few feet away. The boy's heart skipped. He recognized that car. It was his mom's. She stepped out quickly, shutting the door behind her with controlled force. She didn't yell, didn't run, but there was purpose in her stride. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement as she walked toward them, her expression calm but unreadable. The sunlight glinted off something hanging around her neck, a badge. The officers noticed it too. The younger one frowned, confused, but the older one's face changed. He straightened, suddenly more cautious. The boy exhaled in relief, the tension in his chest easing just slightly. His mother didn't say a word yet. She looked at her son first, scanning him from head to toe, making sure he was okay. Only then did she turn her eyes to the officers. Her voice when she spoke was low and measured. "Is there a reason you're stopping my son?" The officers exchanged a quick glance. The older one opened his mouth, but the words didn't come right away. "Ma'am, we were just, there was a report about a—" Her eyes stayed locked on them, calm but firm. The younger officer stepped back a little, unsure of what to say. The boy stood still, watching his mom handle the situation with quiet control. He'd seen her deal with stressful situations before, but never like this. Not with him standing in the middle of it. The officers seemed to realize who they were talking to. She didn't have to raise her voice or make threats. Her presence alone carried authority. The badge around her neck glinted again in the afternoon sun. For the first time since the lights had flashed, the boy felt safe. The air seemed to shift. The tension that had filled the street a few minutes earlier started to thin out. The neighbors behind their windows began to disappear from view, curtains falling back into place. His mom walked closer, standing beside him now. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and looked at him with quiet reassurance. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded. His throat was too tight to speak. The older officer cleared his throat, suddenly more polite. "We just wanted to be sure, ma'am." He matched the description, she finished for him, her tone neutral. "I've heard that before." Neither officer said anything. They shifted awkwardly, waiting for her next move. She looked at her son again, then back at them. "He's going home," she said simply. No one argued. The boy picked up his basketball, still lying on the sidewalk where he'd dropped it. His hands were steady now. As he walked beside his mom toward the car, he didn't look back. The flashing lights behind him dimmed, and the sound of the engine faded into the background. All he could hear was the rhythm of their footsteps and the quiet strength in the way she walked beside him. The house was quiet when they got home. The boy set his basketball down by the door, still thinking about what had just happened. His mom locked the door behind them and stood there for a moment, not speaking. The silence in the living room felt heavy, almost too quiet after all that tension outside. He dropped his backpack on the couch and looked at her, unsure what to say. She looked calm, but her eyes told a different story. There was a mix of anger and relief, the kind that comes when fear finally leaves but frustration stays behind. "You want to tell me what happened?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "They just stopped me," he said. "Said I looked like someone they were looking for. I didn't even do anything." She nodded slowly, listening, her jaw tight. "Did they touch you?" "No," he said quickly. "They just asked questions." I tried to stay calm. I didn't move or anything. Her eyes softened a little, but her voice stayed firm. "You did the right thing," she said. "You stayed calm. You came home safe. That's what matters." He nodded, but the lump in his throat wouldn't go away. he said quietly. They looked at me like I was guilty of something. Like they already decided who I was. She sat down beside him on the couch. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she sighed. I know, she said. And it's not fair. It never is. But that's why I do what I do. He looked at her. You mean your job? She gave a small nod. Yes, I've seen both sides of it. There are good officers, people who want to protect, who care about doing things right. But there are also moments like today, when people make assumptions before they even ask questions. That's what needs to change. He sat back, letting her words sink in. He'd always admired her job, but he'd never really thought about what it meant in moments like this. To him, she was just his mom, the one who made pancakes on weekends and helped him with homework when he got stuck. But now, seeing her like that on the street, standing between him and those officers, he saw her differently. Strong but tired too. She stood up and walked to the kitchen, starting to make tea. You hungry? She asked over her shoulder. Not really, he said. I just don't get it. Why me? She poured hot water into 2 cups and brought one to him. Sometimes, she said, sitting down again, it's not about you. It's about what people see or what they think they see. They make quick judgments. They don't know your story, your heart, or your dreams. They just see what's on the surface. He stared into the cup, watching the steam rise. It's messed up, he said. It is, she agreed. But you can't let that make you bitter. You stay smart. You stay aware. You keep doing what's right. He nodded, though it didn't make the weight in his chest go away. What would have happened if you didn't show up? He asked suddenly. Her hand froze on the cup. The question hung in the air. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at him for a long moment, then reached over and placed her hand on his. You don't need to think about that, she said softly. You're safe now. That's all that matters. He could tell she didn't want to imagine that either. After a while, he went to his room. He dropped onto his bed, staring at the ceiling. The events replayed in his mind like a slow-motion video. The flashing lights, the sharp voices, the feeling of being watched like he didn't belong. It felt unreal, yet too real at the same time. He picked up his phone and scrolled through social media, trying to distract himself. But every few minutes, his mind drifted back to that moment on the street. Down the hall, his mom was still sitting in the living room, scrolling through her own thoughts. She had faced dangerous people before, been in tense situations many times during her career, but nothing compared to seeing her own child standing in that spotlight of suspicion. She had always trained herself to stay calm, to control her emotions, to react with precision. But today, all that training had collided with something raw and personal. She leaned back on the couch, her mind replaying how the officer's expressions changed when she approached. That instant when they realized who she was. The shift from authority to uncertainty. She had seen it before. How quickly attitudes could change when power met power. And it bothered her that it took a badge to make them stop and think. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from a colleague at work who had already heard about the incident. News traveled fast in her world. You okay? Heard something happened near your block. She replied simply. We're fine. I handled it. But even as she typed the words, her hands trembled slightly. She wasn't as fine as she claimed. Later that evening, she knocked softly on her son's door. Mind if I come in? He looked up from his phone. Yeah, sure. She sat down on the edge of his bed. You know, she began, when I joined the bureau, I told myself I'd never let fear control me. Not in the field, not anywhere. But today, when I saw you standing there, she paused, taking a breath. That was the first time I truly felt afraid. He looked at her, surprised. You're never scared. She smiled faintly. Everyone gets scared. The trick is what you do with it. He thought about that for a moment. You didn't look scared. That's because I couldn't afford to be, she said. In moments like that, people read every move you make. One wrong tone, one wrong look, it can change everything. So I stayed calm. For you. He swallowed hard. Thanks, Mom. She reached out and smoothed his hair like she used to when he was younger. You don't have to thank me, she said quietly. Just promise me something. What? Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll remember who you are. You're smart, respectful, and kind. Don't let anyone make you feel less than that. He nodded slowly. I promise. They sat there for a while, not saying much. The house was still quiet, but the air felt a little lighter now. The fear had faded, replaced by something stronger. Understanding. The next morning, The sunlight filtered through the curtains. He got up early even though it was the weekend. He wanted to walk outside just to prove to himself that he could. His mom was already in the kitchen dressed for work. She gave him a small smile when she saw him. "Going out?" she asked. "Just to the corner store," he said. "I'll be careful." She hesitated for a second, then nodded. "All right. Text me when you get there." He grabbed a jacket and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the neighborhood quiet again like it always was. The same street that had felt like a trap yesterday now looked ordinary again. Kids riding bikes, a dog barking behind a fence, a mail carrier making rounds. But something inside him had changed. He noticed things more. The sound of engines, the glance of strangers, the way people crossed paths. He wasn't paranoid, just aware. He understood now what his mom had meant by staying smart. When he reached the store, he texted her like he promised. She replied instantly, "Got it." "Proud of you," he smiled at the screen. Those 3 words meant more than she probably realized. Back at work, she sat at her desk, staring at her computer but not really seeing it. Her mind kept drifting to her son walking down that street again. She trusted him to be careful, but a part of her wished she could always be there, just a few steps behind him, ready if the world ever tried to treat him unfairly again. Her phone rang. It was her supervisor. "I heard about what happened yesterday," he said. "You want to file an internal report?" She paused. "Not yet," she said finally. "I talked to the officers afterward. I think they got the message. Still," he said, "these things shouldn't happen, especially not to family." She nodded even though he couldn't see her. "You're right, but I don't want this to turn into another headline. I just want to make sure it never happens again to anyone." After hanging up, she leaned back and looked out the window. The city stretched wide below, full of stories, some fair, some not. She'd always believed change came one decision at a time, one conversation at a time. Maybe now it was time to start that conversation from her own living room. That evening, she and her son sat at the dinner table. The air was easier now, laughter slipping in between bites. They talked about school, about basketball, about plans for the weekend. For a while, things felt normal again. But under that calm surface, both of them knew something had shifted. He had seen how quickly ordinary moments could turn uncertain. She had seen how fragile safety could feel, even in familiar places. But they also knew something else, how strength could rise quietly in steady hearts and calm voices. Before bed, she peeked into his room. He was already asleep, one arm hanging off the side of the bed. She smiled softly and whispered to herself, "That's my boy." Then she turned off the light, carrying with her a silent promise that she would use her badge, her voice, and her courage to make sure no mother would have to feel that same fear again. Outside, the neighborhood was peaceful once more. But in that quiet peace lived a lesson they would both remember forever. The next few days passed quietly, but the memory of that afternoon stayed with both of them. The boy tried to move on, pretending everything was fine. He went to school, played basketball, and laughed with his friends like always. But sometimes when he was walking alone, he'd feel that same tightness in his chest again. Every time he saw a patrol car on the street, his body tensed without meaning to. He would force himself to breathe and remind himself that he was safe. Still, the uneasiness lingered. His mother noticed it. She saw the small changes, the way he checked over his shoulder more often, how he avoided walking home alone at sunset. He didn't talk about it, but she didn't need him to. She'd seen it in too many young faces before, the look of someone who had just learned how fragile peace could be. She wanted to protect him from that feeling, but she also knew she couldn't protect him from the world forever. So she decided to take a different approach. If she couldn't erase what happened, maybe she could use it to make something better. One morning, she called her office and said she'd be late. Instead, she drove down to the local police station. She'd thought about it for days, wondering if it was worth it, if saying something would change anything. But her gut told her she had to try. When she walked through the glass doors, the front desk officer greeted her politely, unaware of who she was. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked. "Yes," she said calmly. "I'd like to speak to the watch commander." He asked for her name. When she gave it, recognition flashed across his face. Within minutes, a sergeant came out from an office at the back, his expression polite but guarded. "Good morning," he said. I heard you wanted to talk. She nodded. Yes, it's about an incident that happened last week on Maple Street. 2 of your officers stopped my son. He gestured for her to follow him into his office. She took a seat across from his desk, resting her hands calmly on her lap. I'm not here to file a complaint, she began. But I think we need to talk about what happened. The sergeant leaned back slightly. I see. Were you present during the stop? Yes, she said. I arrived before it ended. And what exactly is your concern? He asked carefully. She looked him in the eye. That my son was stopped for no clear reason. That he was treated like a suspect when he was just walking home. That the situation could have gone very differently. He nodded slowly, his expression serious now. I understand your concern, ma'am. I'll look into it. I appreciate that, she said. But I don't just want it looked into. I want it learned from. My son is 16. He did everything right. He was respectful, calm, and cooperative. But he was still treated as if he was dangerous. The sergeant sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. We've been working on more training around community interactions, he said. But sometimes in the field, things get complicated. I know, she said, her tone steady. I work in law enforcement too. I understand the pressure. I understand the instinct to react quickly. But I also understand the power that comes with that uniform. Every decision matters. Every choice sets an example. The sergeant's eyebrows lifted slightly. Law enforcement, may I ask? She reached into her bag and placed her badge on the desk. FBI. He blinked, caught off guard. His posture straightened immediately. I see, he said, choosing his words carefully now. I'm not here as an agent, she said. I'm here as a mother. But I also know how easily situations like that can spiral. I've seen it too many times from the other side. He nodded again, more slowly this time. I'll talk to the officers personally. And I'm sorry this happened. She studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Thank you. That's all I wanted to hear, for now. After she left the station, she sat in her car for a few minutes before starting the engine. The sunlight hit the windshield, warm and bright. She took a deep breath and told herself she'd done the right thing. Change didn't happen overnight, but conversations like that were where it started. That evening, when her son came home from school, she was already in the kitchen making dinner. He dropped his backpack on the floor and leaned against the counter. You went to work early? He asked. Not exactly, she said, smiling faintly. I stopped by the police station. He froze. You did? I did, she said simply. I talked to their supervisor. I wanted them to understand what happened wasn't okay. He looked at her with wide eyes. What did they say? They listened, she said. That's a start. He thought about it for a moment. Do you think it'll make a difference? She shrugged. Maybe not right away, but one day it will. He nodded slowly, watching her stir the pot on the stove. You're brave, he said quietly. She smiled without turning around. No, I'm just a mom. They both laughed softly, and for the first time since that day, the heaviness between them began to lift a little. Later that week, something unexpected happened. The sergeant she'd spoken to reached out to her office. He asked if she'd be willing to speak at a community police meeting they were organizing, something meant to rebuild trust between officers and residents. He said he thought her perspective might help. She hesitated at first. She wasn't used to mixing her personal life with her professional one. But then she thought about her son, and about all the other kids who walked home each day with the same kind of worry in their hearts. Maybe this was the moment to say something that mattered. The meeting was held at the community center the following Saturday. The room was filled with local residents, officers, and city officials. People sat in folding chairs, murmuring quietly as they waited for things to start. Her son came too, sitting near the back, curious but quiet. When it was her turn to speak, she walked up to the small stage and looked out at the crowd. She could see both uniforms and civilian clothes, young faces and old ones, curiosity and caution in equal measure. She took a slow breath before speaking. A few days ago, she began, Something happened that changed the way I see this community, not as an FBI agent, but as a mother. The room went still. My teenage son was stopped by two officers, she continued. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was walking home, listening to music the same as he's done dozens of times before. But in that moment, he wasn't seen as a kid heading home. He was seen as a possible threat. She paused, letting her words settle. "I'm not here to point fingers," she said. "I'm here because I believe we can do better. Because I believe most of you joined this job for the right reasons. To protect, not to intimidate. But sometimes good intentions get buried under fear, and fear can make people forget to see the human being standing in front of them." Some people nodded quietly. A few officers shifted in their seats, listening closely. She continued, her tone calm but firm. "I've worn a badge for over a decade. I understand the split-second decisions, the risks, the uncertainty, but we also have to understand what our presence means to others. To a teenager on his way home, that flashing light might not feel like protection. It might feel like danger. That's what we need to fix. Not with blame, but with awareness." Her son watched her from the back row, pride swelling in his chest. He'd never seen her like this before, calm, confident, and powerful in a quiet way. She wasn't angry or loud. She was steady, the kind of steady that made people listen. When she finished, the room stayed silent for a moment, then the crowd began to clap, softly at first, then stronger. Even a few officers joined in. Afterward, people came up to talk to her. Some thanked her for sharing her story. One officer admitted he'd never thought about what it felt like from the other side. Another mother said her own son had gone through something similar and that hearing her speak had given her hope. Her son stood beside her, smiling shyly as people greeted her. When they finally left, the evening air felt lighter. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink. In the car, her son turned to her. "That was amazing," he said. "You really made them listen." She smiled, starting the engine. "Sometimes people just need to be reminded," she said. "Reminded of what?" he asked. She looked at him and said softly, "That we're all human. That's the part people forget the most." He nodded, staring out the window as the city lights began to glow. He didn't say anything else, but something in him felt different now, stronger. What had started as fear had turned into understanding, and understanding had turned into purpose. At home that night, he sat at his desk, thinking about everything that had happened. The stop, his mother's courage, the meeting. For the first time, he thought maybe he wanted to follow in her footsteps someday. Not because of the badge or authority, but because of the difference she made just by standing up and speaking calmly for what was right. Down the hall, his mom looked out her window at the quiet street below. The same street that had once filled her with fear now felt like a symbol of change. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was a start. And sometimes, that was enough. The two officers stood tense in the middle of the sidewalk. Their radios crackled softly, and one of them kept his hand resting near his belt. The boy stood still, trying to breathe evenly, trying not to make a sudden move. His heart felt like it was about to burst out of his chest. The street was quiet except for the hum of traffic in the distance. A few people had gathered across the road, pretending to look at their phones but clearly watching. He wished he could disappear. One of the officers asked again, "What are you doing around here?" The boy stammered, "Just walking home from practice, sir." He tried to make his voice calm, but it trembled anyway. The taller officer frowned and asked for his ID. The boy explained that his wallet was in his gym bag at school. The officer sighed loudly and muttered something under his breath. The boy didn't catch the words, but he knew it wasn't kind. Then, far down the street, a dark SUV turned the corner and began driving toward them, the driver's eyes fixed on the flashing lights ahead. It was his mother. She had just finished work when her phone buzzed with a text from a neighbor saying her son was being stopped by the police on Maple Street. For a second, she couldn't even breathe. Every fear she had buried deep inside came rushing back. She didn't think twice. She turned her car around, heart pounding, and sped through the neighborhood, praying she wouldn't be too late. She had been with the FBI for almost a decade, trained to handle every kind of crisis. But this wasn't a case or a mission. This was her child, and that made it completely different. Her mind ran through every possibility as she got closer. She reminded herself to stay calm, to approach carefully, but the sight of those flashing blue lights ahead made her foot press harder on the gas pedal. When she finally pulled up, she saw her son standing with his hands raised, the officers on either side of him. The sight hit her like a punch to the chest. For a brief moment, she froze. Then instinct took over. She parked the car quickly, stepped out, and straightened her jacket. Around her neck hung her badge, heavy, shining in the afternoon light. She started walking fast toward them, her expression firm, her steps confident. The officers noticed her almost immediately. The shorter one raised a hand, shouting, "Ma'am, please step back." She didn't stop walking. Her tone was calm, but her voice carried enough authority to cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here, officers?" she asked as she came closer. The taller officer glanced at her badge, squinting. For a second, he didn't register what he was seeing. Then his eyes widened. He nudged his partner, whispering, "That's a federal badge." The other one looked again and froze. The woman's presence changed the entire mood in seconds. The tension that had hung so heavy now turned into a kind of nervous silence. "That's my son," she said, her voice low but steady. The words landed hard. Both officers shifted awkwardly. One quickly took his hand off his belt. The other stammered, "We were just checking. He matched a description." She stopped a few feet from them and looked straight into their eyes. "A description?" she asked. "And what description was that exactly?" Her tone wasn't raised, but every word carried weight. The taller officer swallowed hard before replying. "We got a report about a possible break-in nearby. The suspect was a young male wearing a dark hoodie. Her gaze didn't waver. So you saw a teenager walking home in a hoodie and decided to stop him?" The officers exchanged nervous glances. She didn't wait for their answer. She turned to her son. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. He nodded, though his voice cracked when he said, "Yeah, I'm fine." She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder and turned back to the officers. Her posture was calm but powerful. "Do you have any evidence connecting him to this supposed report?" The shorter officer hesitated. "No, ma'am, just," she cut in. "Then this stop is over." The officers looked at each other again, not sure what to do next. Finally, the taller one mumbled, "Of course, Agent, we just wanted to make sure everything was in order." She gave him a look that said enough without words. "You made it very clear what was in order, officer," she replied. The people watching from across the street started to whisper. They could tell something had shifted. The power dynamic had flipped in an instant. What moments ago felt like danger now felt like justice quietly walking in. The woman's calm presence made the officers seem suddenly small, unsure of their next move. One of the officers finally said, "We didn't know," and she interrupted again. "That's the problem. You didn't know. You didn't take the time to know. You just reacted." Her voice wasn't angry. It was disappointed, almost sad. "He's a kid. He was just walking home. That's all." The officers nodded, apologizing under their breath. She didn't say another word to them. Instead, she turned to her son and said, "Let's go home." Together, they walked back to her car. The boy kept his eyes down, still trying to process what had just happened. She opened the passenger door for him and waited until he got in before circling to the driver's side. As they drove away, neither of them spoke for a while. The car was filled with quiet. Finally, she asked softly, "Did they touch you?" He shook his head. "No, but they yelled. I didn't know what to do." She nodded, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "You did the right thing," she said. "You stayed calm. That's what saved you." He turned to her and asked quietly, "Would they have listened if you weren't, an agent?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the road. "Maybe," she said finally, "but probably not." Her voice cracked just slightly at the end. They passed the park where he usually stopped to shoot hoops. It looked peaceful now, the late sun spilling across the grass, kids laughing in the distance. The world seemed so normal again, but nothing about this felt normal anymore. At the next red light, she reached over and squeezed his hand. "You're safe now," she whispered. But deep down, she knew safety shouldn't depend on a badge. It should come from being treated fairly, from being seen as a person, not a threat. When they got home, she parked in the driveway and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she turned toward him and said softly, "What happened today? It's not your fault. Don't carry that weight." He nodded but didn't look up. She wanted to tell him everything she'd learned over the years, how fear can twist people's judgment, how prejudice hides in places you don't expect. But she also knew he didn't need a lecture. He needed comfort, so she just said, "You did nothing wrong." Later that night, when the house was quiet, she sat in the living room staring at the badge lying on the table. It gleamed faintly under the lamplight. She thought about how powerful it had seemed a few hours ago, how it had changed everything the moment she showed it. And then she thought about her son, how powerless he had felt without it. That contrast stayed with her. She had spent years believing that justice was about laws and evidence. But now she understood it was also about perception, about how people choose to see others before they even speak. She decided she wouldn't just let it go. The next day, she would call the department and file a formal report. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she wanted accountability. She wanted those officers to remember the look on her son's face, the fear, the confusion, and understand what their actions meant. But that night, before doing anything else, she went to her son's room. He was already in bed, eyes half closed. She sat beside him quietly. He opened his eyes and whispered, "Mom, thanks for coming." Her throat tightened. She brushed his hair back and smiled softly. "There's nowhere else I would have been," she said. He closed his eyes again, finally able to rest. She stayed there for a while, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. It was the sound of peace she wasn't sure she could ever take for granted again. Outside, the same quiet street stretched on, still and calm. But for this family, everything had changed. The world had shown them how fragile safety could be, and how a mother's strength could turn fear into silence with just one steady step forward. The next morning, the sun slipped through the curtains and filled the kitchen with a soft glow. The house was quiet except for the sound of birds outside. The woman stood by the counter, staring into her coffee cup, deep in thought. She hadn't slept much. Her mind had replayed the scene over and over. The flashing lights, her son's frightened face, the way the officers' expressions changed the second they saw her badge. She kept hearing his question in her head. Would they have listened if you weren't an agent? It hurt because she knew the answer. She had seen too much in her line of work not to know. She could still picture her son standing on that sidewalk, completely still, too scared to even reach into his pocket. The thought made her chest tighten again. Her son walked in quietly, dressed for school but moving slower than usual. He gave her a small smile, but his eyes looked tired. She asked gently, "You ready to go?" He nodded, but she could tell he wasn't. He hesitated before saying, "I don't want everyone talking about it." She nodded slowly, understanding. "They don't need to know everything," she said. "But if anyone asks, you tell them you handled yourself with courage." He sat down at the table and picked at his breakfast, not really eating. She sat across from him just watching, thinking about how quickly life could shift from normal to terrifying. He used to walk that route home every day without a second thought. Now she wasn't sure she could let him anymore. On the drive to school, the silence between them was heavy but comfortable. She wanted to say something to make it all easier, but words felt small compared to what had happened. Finally, she said, "You know, sometimes life puts us in moments that change how we see the world. What matters is what we do with that." He looked out the window and said softly, "I just don't get why they thought I did something wrong." She exhaled slowly. "Because some people see what they expect instead of what's real. They look at color before they look at character. It's unfair, but it's why people like me fight to change things." He was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Did you ever go through something like that?" She paused before answering. "Not exactly like that, but I've seen it happen more times than I can count." She glanced at him, her voice low. "That's why I became what I am, so I could stand between the wrong and the right, even when it's uncomfortable." When they reached the school, he unbuckled his seatbelt but didn't open the door right away. He looked at her and said, "Thanks for coming yesterday. If you didn't show up..." His voice trailed off, but she knew what he meant. She smiled gently. "I'll always show up," she said. After he walked inside, she sat in the car for a long time. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, her mind spinning. She thought about all the parents who didn't have badges to flash, who couldn't walk up and stop a situation before it went wrong. That thought stayed with her the whole drive to her office. At work, she sat at her desk staring at her computer screen without really seeing it. Her colleagues greeted her as usual, but she barely responded. Finally, she opened her email and began typing a report, not as an FBI agent documenting a case, but as a mother documenting an experience that could not be ignored. She wrote every detail she remembered: the stop, the officer's tone, her arrival, the shift in their behavior. She kept her words professional but honest. When she finished, she attached it to a message addressed to her supervisor with a note that said, "For awareness and review." Then she hit send. It wasn't about revenge or anger. It was about accountability. She wanted those officers to think before they acted the next time. She wanted training that went deeper than words on paper, something that made people understand how their fear and bias could hurt others. Later that day, her supervisor called her in. He listened quietly as she explained everything. He nodded, his expression serious. "You did the right thing," he said, "and we'll handle it the right way." She appreciated that, but she knew change wasn't simple. It would take time, and it would take courage for more than just one person. That evening when she came home, her son was sitting in the living room with his headphones on, sketching in a notebook. He looked peaceful again, lost in his art. She watched him for a moment before saying, "What are you drawing?" He turned the notebook around. It was a simple picture, two figures standing under a streetlight. One taller, one shorter. The taller one had a badge shining on their chest. The shorter one had a basketball under his arm. She smiled softly. "That's beautiful." He shrugged and said, "It's just how I remember it." Then he looked up at her and added, "You looked really calm when you walked up. Weren't you scared?" Her answer came slowly, terrified. "But I couldn't show it, because if I did, they might have seen weakness. And in that moment, we couldn't afford weakness." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about moving anyway." He nodded, and something in his expression changed. For the first time since it happened, he seemed to stand a little taller, like he understood something deeper about his mother, and about himself. Days passed, and the story quietly spread through the neighborhood. People who had seen the scene that day talked about it, but in hushed voices. Some came to her privately, thanking her for how she handled it. Others avoided the subject altogether. That was fine with her. She didn't need attention. What mattered was that her son was safe. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the local police department. It was an official apology for the incident, promising to review their procedures and offer more training on bias and community relations. She read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. Words were easy. Actions would tell the real story. That weekend, they went for a walk through the same neighborhood. The sun was bright and the air felt lighter than it had in weeks. Her son was quiet at first, glancing around like the memory was still fresh. She told him gently, "You can't let fear take this place from you. This is still your home. You still belong here." He nodded slowly. "I know." Then, after a pause, he asked, "Do you think they'll ever change?" She thought about it for a moment before saying, "People can change. Systems can change. But it takes people who care enough to push for it. That's why what we do matters." They walked side by side, the sound of their footsteps mixing with the soft wind. Every few steps she'd glance at him and see the reflection of his father in his walk, in his quiet strength. It made her smile. She realized that what happened didn't just frighten him. It shaped him. He'd seen the world for what it could be, both cruel and kind, and he was learning to carry that understanding without letting it harden him. That night, he came into her room holding his sketchbook again. "Can I show you something?" he asked. She nodded. On the page was a new drawing, a badge, but this time it wasn't shining alone. Next to it was a heart. Underneath he had written, "Strength doesn't need power. It just needs truth." She stared at it for a moment, her eyes stinging a little. She hugged him tightly and said, "You have no idea how proud I am of you." He smiled against her shoulder and said, "I think I get it now, Mom. It's not about the badge, right?" She pulled back and looked at him. "Exactly. It's about who you are when no one's watching." In the weeks that followed, things slowly went back to normal. But normal didn't mean the same. The boy walked taller, spoke clearer, and understood his world a little better. His mother kept her promise to protect him, to teach him, and to keep fighting for the kind of world where a badge wouldn't be needed to demand respect. Sometimes, she'd catch him looking at his reflection in the mirror, adjusting his hoodie before heading out, and she'd see that little pause, that tiny hesitation, but he'd still step outside with courage. And every time he did, she whispered a silent prayer that the world would meet him with kindness. Life went on. School, games, laughter. The memory of that day never fully left them, but it stopped defining them. It became a lesson they carried quietly between them, a story of fear that turned into strength, of injustice that turned into awareness, of love that stood tall in the face of danger. And though the world outside was far from perfect, they both learned something powerful. Sometimes, the smallest act of courage, a mother stepping forward, a son standing still, can change everything.